It's a huge privilege to be with you. It really is. I'm so aware that most of you, all of you, could also be up here teaching us. It was many years ago I came across a saying by D.T. Niles about evangelism, and I'm sure it's about teaching as well. But he once said that evangelism is one beggar helping another beggar to find food. That really just landed very deeply in my heart. I think teaching in many ways is one beggar helping another beggar to find food. And I hope that together we will be able to find some food in our evening session. A sentence that I've often heard, and particularly through the COVID time and since COVID, a sentence that goes something like this. I'm just feeling very overwhelmed at the moment. Overwhelming just seems to be so deeply characteristic of our time. Overwhelming within our own personal lives, overwhelming within our relational lives, our vocational lives, our national lives. Our overwhelmings are multi-layered. They are multi-layered. One of my own teachers often says to me that in a moment of overwhelming, name it. Can you name it, Trevor? And then describe it. And then, intriguingly, pay attention to the shape of your living. And I think that's because overwhelming knocks our life out of shape. When I'm overwhelmed, my life gets knocked out of shape. So name it, describe it, and then pay attention to the shape of your living. And that's my responsibility. God is not going to do that for me. And it's against that backdrop that I want to offer you a model that has helped me since early 1980s to stay attentive to the shape of my own living, for better and for worse. Perhaps I can give you some background to the model so you have some of the background in your mind. I first came across Frank Lake. He was a psychiatrist, British psychiatrist, UK. He wrote, I remember at university studying a thick book entitled Clinical Theology. And he was one of the very first people, I think, to begin to integrate very deeply his own insights as a psychiatrist and his insights of his own faith. He was a person who followed Christ. He had a very close relationship with missionaries who went from the UK to India. And what struck him again and again and again was that so many missionaries who left with a sense of calling and vocation and enthusiasm and energy were often returning to the UK in a place of disillusionment and cynicism and deep discouragement, and often would end up with him. And he was just very mindful of the fact that something was skewed. Evidently, and I was taught this by Reverend Anne Long. She's a British Anglican, a beautiful woman. She's about 10 years older than me. And in 1990, when I was able to be with her in the UK, she was a student of Frank Lake. And she gave me some more background to this model that evidently Frank Lake met this Swiss theologian, Emil Brunner, in India on one of his visits. And I've always found that quite special, a psychiatrist and a theologian coming together. It's kind of just has an integrative feel about it, which I value very deeply. And they together shared their concerns about the plight of missionaries. So what they did, and again this is also intriguing, they decided to go on to retreat together for, I think it was 2-3 days, and what they would simply do would be to immerse themselves in the gospel life of Jesus, which I think is a very good thing to do. It always recalls a moment when Dallas was in South Africa, Dallas Willard, and he was staying in our home, and one night I really wanted to impress him, and he was sitting in the lounge, and I went with a yellow pad, and I went into the lounge, and I said, Dallas, do you have any kind of, a really good philosophical, theological books that I can just make a note of, that you think I should be reading? And he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, yep, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then he said, again, it was his finishing sentence, he said, spent about 20 years. And those 20 years have gone on into the 30s now. Keeping company with Jesus in the Gospels. It's so fundamental, I think. And as they did that, they came out with this model which they call the cycle of grace. You may think it's badly drawn, but it's meant to look like this. It's provisional, it has limitations like all models. I would like you to interact with it. You may see the limitations clearer than I do, and you'll let me know, I'm sure. But one of the very first things that they noted together, and I found this quite helpful, is that Jesus lived with some kind of harmony in his own life. And they used terms which are dated, and I will use most of their language except in one place. That Jesus lived kind of, some people don't like the word balance, but some kind of harmony between input and output in his ministry. Let me just read to you 24 hours in the life of Jesus. Let me just read it to you. Here's 24 hours in the life of Jesus. It's from Mark chapter 1. And as I read it to you, you may like to get a sense of how input and output is happening in Jesus' life in these 24 hours. As soon as they left the synagogue, where would you put that? Input or output? As soon as they left the synagogue. Input. Time of worship, gathering together with his people. Jesus would go to the synagogue. Every time he went to the synagogue, there was trouble. He was a kind of internal critic, as it were, of his own faith and tradition. As soon as they left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. You have an element there, friendship, colleagueship. Where would you put that? Input, output. Input, no? Friendship, colleagueship. Now Simon's mother-in-law, was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. He came. This is a very tender scene. He took her by the hand and he lifted her up. The fever left her and she began to serve them. And you have a sense there of ministry, of output. And then verse 32, I've always been quite struck by this scene. That evening at sunset, they brought him all who were sick or possessed with demons, and the whole city was gathered around the door. You have a sense of Jesus there being immersed in human suffering. Absolutely immersed in it. Physical, mental, spiritual. And he cured many, not all, many who were sick with various diseases. He cast out many demons, and he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. You'd almost expect that after a night like that he would sleep in. Verse 35, in the morning while it was still very dark, he got up and he went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. Input, output. Get the rhythm. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. That's a strong word, that, hunted for him. And when they found him, they said to him, everyone is searching for you. I find this also again very intriguing. He answered, let us go to the neighboring towns so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came to do. And I just sense the absence of reaction. He doesn't react. There's a sense, there's a sense of inner direction in his life. Mimi was speaking about drinking from Abba's well, and you have a sense that that's been taking place, and he has a sense of direction and what his next step needs to be. But I just read that to you to just get a sense of the input and out, just the input and output, the rhythms. Maybe that's a better word. Just the rhythms of input and output in his life. And you may want to begin to wonder about your own rhythms just for a moment, for what it's worth. And then they make the observation that kind of energy, life, flowed in to Jesus' life in two ways. In two deep ways. That grace, the energy of grace, flowed into his life in two particular ways. And I don't know how this will sound to you, but that on the one hand, Jesus lived with a profound sense of acceptance. Profound sense of acceptance. You know, when you think of his life, you think of that inaugural moment of his public ministry. Do you remember his baptism? When he goes down to the River Jordan, John the Baptizer there. I never call him John the Baptist because then the Baptists think they own him. Can you understand? John the Methodist or John the So John the Baptizer. So John the Baptizer. I don't know about you, it's so poignant, you know, here are people flooding in, the riffraff of humanity, flooding into the river to be baptized, and Jesus goes in with them. Just an overwhelming solidarity with humanity. Overwhelming. Just goes in with them. I find that just when I let my imagination linger on that, deeply moving. And you know what happens. The dove comes, the voice, you are my beloved. You're my beloved. And now Jesus is ready to minister. There have been 30 years of hidden preparation. That ratio has always struck me, 30 years of hidden preparation and 3 years of public ministry. Somewhere we got it wrong. 30 years of hidden preparation, 3 years of public ministry. And so Jesus, knowing that he now is, and he knows in his humanity that he is uniquely God's beloved, is ready to minister. And you will know that from there is the wilderness experience in his first sermon when he goes into Galilee proclaiming the kingdom of God is at hand, is available. That Jesus lived knowing that he was accepted and loved and cherished and treasured. You are my son. I delight in you. I delight in you. And you will know that he hears that voice one other time in his life. In a similar way, it would seem. And you'll remember that happens at the Transfiguration. And again, his own unique identity is affirmed as God's beloved. As God's beloved. And now he's ready to go to the cross. Now he's ready to give himself. Now he's ready to die. It's almost as if you need to know who you are before you are free to give yourself and to lay your life down freely. And you will know that there's that poignant moment in the foot washing, as John describes it, knowing that he had come from God and was returning to God. There again, there is a sense of identity. But I want to suggest something, and think about it with me if you don't mind, that Jesus not only is the unique, beloved Son of the Father, but that his whole ministry is about helping those around them to know that they are also God's beloved. It almost seems as if that is that's the impulse of his ministry. He wants people to know that they are deeply loved by God. Deeply loved. That they too are God's beloved. And so you have John writing many years later, how great is the Father's love that has been lavished upon us, that we should be called children of God. And that is what we are. Where did he get that from? Where did he get that? The ministry of Christ in his life. And so often when I keep company with Jesus in the Gospels, I'm often struck by how he just helps people to know that they are God's beloved. With his words, I think of his parables, a woman looking for a coin. That coin is unrepeatable. It has to be found. It just has to be found. I think of his actions. That woman being judged by that group of religious men. And Jesus coming, I don't condemn you. Go now and do not sin again. Howard Thurman, my favorite American theologian, says that in that moment Jesus placed a crown on that woman's head that she would keep growing tall enough to wear for the rest of her life. She knows who she's beloved. She's beloved. And so I'm wondering tonight where you find your identity. Where do I find my identity? Where do we tend to find it? I think it's one of the deepest questions that we engage in our life. It starts when we may be 13, 14 years of age, and then accompanies us for the rest of our life. Where do I find my identity? I think of Henry Nouwen's well-known grid, I am what I do, I am what others think about me, I am what I've achieved, and you can just add on even more to that. I am my greatest failure, I am my deepest success. Identity, so deep. Jesus ministered from a deep sense of acceptance. And then the second thing that they point out in there is that grace poured in another. And you'll notice that as grace pours in, this gets thicker and thicker and thicker. It's just indicative of the energy and the life and the resource that Jesus lived. Forgive my spelling. He lived in a rhythm of sustenance. He lived in a rhythm of sustenance. Grace flowed into his life in so many different ways. And maybe we can do a quick brainstorm here, and I know it's late, and I know you're tired, but let's give it our best shot. Can you think of ways in which grace flows into Jesus' life? Ways in which he received. Ways in which there was, as it were, input into his life. And we'll just make a note of some of the ways. I did this tonight is like part one. We'll do part two later when we meet again. But I'll never forget doing this with a group of folk over a weekend. We came up with 42 ways from the Gospels in which Jesus received life and energy. We'll go to about 5 tonight. So can you just give me some, just give it to me.
Prayer.
Sorry?
Prayer.
Prayer.
Friendship.
Can I just say a few? I'm going to give each one a bit of airtime. Prayer with others, prayer on his own. I think often prayer went along with silence and solitude. He went away to a deserted space. So let's just build it up a little bit and have an imagination around it. Solitude and silence. Yeah. I heard another one.
Friendship.
Friendship. Oh, friendship. Again, I think this is totally underestimated in the Gospels. Just think of the circles of friendship in Jesus' life. He's the beloved disciple, Mary Magdalene, Peter, James, John, the 12, the 70, the group of women, Mary, Martha, Lazarus. You just have this multi-layered richness of friendship in his life. And then that poignant sentence near the end of his life, John 17 or so, 24, Father, I thank you for these whom you have given to me. They've been a gift for me. It's powerful. Can we keep going?
Eating with others.
Sorry?
I said eating with others.
Eating, yeah.
Like
Eating. Meal times. Someone pointed out to me that we know more of what Jesus said at meal times from the Gospels than what he said in the synagogue. That's quite a powerful thing. But it just seemed to be a very beautiful part of his life, meal sharing.
I was thinking a little bit differently.
Yeah, go for it.
I asked, well, what are the things that are for me that I think? And it's when I have like an aha moment, or when the people around me have an aha moment. And I feel like Jesus has a lot of those aha moments throughout.
Okay. Can we put that down?
That's great.
wine and celebration.
Sorry?
Wine
and celebration. Yeah, certainly. It's interesting in John's Gospel, he calls the disciples, the first place he takes them to is not a prayer meeting, but to a wedding. I find that really interesting, So a very celebrative lifestyle. Celebration and wine. It's quite hard for a Methodist to write celebration and wine. But, sometimes Jesus was just like such a joyful person. He had this incredible ability to hold suffering and joy in his heart. Incredible capacity. Man of sorrows, man of joy. Not one or the other. Both and. Both and. And that has been a mystery for me for a long, long time. Can we take one or two more? One or two more ways in which you have a sense of Jesus receiving sustenance and energy and life. And again, don't get into a split spirituality of religious ways and non-religious ways. Just, how do you see it happening in the Gospels?
Maybe unhurried time.
Kind of unhurried. You think of his movement between villages, the walking, kind of the pace of walking. I'm going to put walking, and I'm also going to put unhurried.
Trevor, what about his rhythm of festivals and being in the store?
Thank you.
His rhythm of festivals and being in the store.
At times going down to Jerusalem, the festival life of Jesus. So we could go on and on here, we really could. There's a lot of things missing there, worship.
Children.
Children! Hey, I was waiting for children. I wonder what they seem to mean so much to you. We could put worship there, we could put fasting there, we could put his own immersion in the Psalms, so much. But let's just leave it there for the moment. There was sustenance. But now we come to the output in Jesus' life. And this piece for me was a bit of a lifesaver. That his output, and I'm going to use the word of the model, that Jesus lived with a profound sense of significance. A profound sense of significance. So that his ministry to others was not only at the level of doing, it was also at the level of being. It was at the level of who he was, of what he brought to others. And so you have a sense of the significance often in the I am sayings. I'm the bread of life. I'm the light of the world. I'm the door. And you have a sense of Jesus offering himself at the level of being to others. And this is, I think, a very big piece for us. To quote Dallas Willard, we are meant to count. We've been created to count. Just like water is created, he says, to run downhill. We are created for significance. We're created to have a sense of significance in our being. And you may wonder what I'm trying to say here, and I hope I can make this clear. I love these first four letters, the word S-I-G-N, the word sign. In what way, and I think this can be, I think, our deepest source of significance. And once we've got some clearness around how God is calling us to be, it becomes a wonderful criteria for discerning decisions and making choices. What is in sync with my sense of calling to be, and where am I out of sync? We can say much more about this, and we will say much more about this, particularly in our next time together. Just want to get it out there now. I'm going to change the word here from the initial model. The initial model was achievement, that Jesus' life flowed out in achievement in ministry. And somehow I've always battled with that word for some reason. And I'm going to put the word fruitfulness. It ties into Mimi's emphasis on the vine as well. That there was in Jesus' life a fruitfulness in ministry. And we can think of the many ways in which that fruitfulness is expressed. And again, we could do a brainstorm now. I'm not going to do it. But the sense of how Jesus pulled people together in a team, got them engaged in God's dream, how Jesus shared good news with people, how he taught in parables, how he brought healing and deliverance to people, how he kind of reached out to those on the edges, how he fed hungry people. One can just go on, but you have a sense of just immense fruitfulness in his life. And the energy now flowing through flows out. And so it becomes thinner because energy is going out of him. But Jesus lived in the cycle. It's a dynamic cycle. It's not like I tick off acceptance, let's move to sustenance, tick off, tick, 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 and now I've got the 4 ticks. But it's a sense of a dynamic cycle. And in fact, when Frank Lake first gave this model in, I think, clinical theology, he calls it the dynamic cycle. Now, remember, Lake and Brunner were concerned about disillusionment, cynicism, loss of calling. That is what worried them, concerned them. And then, and this is where the light went on, for me, in a very deep way and bright way, is that they felt that the missionaries were not living this way around. They were living this way around. They were living this way around. They were starting here, hoping to achieve, hoping to do things, hoping that would give them some significance if they could get this one right. Then hoping the sense of significance would give them some sustenance for the journey, and maybe in the end they would have a sense of identity. They didn't live in a cycle of grace. They lived in a cycle of works. They lived this way around. This way around. And so maybe a question for us tonight is just like, which way do you feel you're living? And maybe we do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and in one day, one moment we're going this way, and another moment we're going this way. But it might be helpful to get a sense of just the dominant way in which I live my life. In a cycle of grace, in a cycle of works. Pay attention to the shape of our living. In moments of overwhelming, pay attention to the shape of our life, the shape of our living. It's so critical. So critical. And one can enlarge on this. What way do we parent? Do I parent this way around? Or do I parent this way around? How was I parented? Was I parented that way around? Was I parented this way around? How do I relate to others? How does the church I pastor operate? Does it operate in a cycle of grace? With our first word being a word of acceptance to anyone and everyone? Or do we work on this way that somehow you've got to tick this box in order to have significance in our congregation, and maybe then we'll accept you at the end? Which way? So I just wonder, for a few minutes, I just wonder if we can pause. I don't want to just feel this another dump some information on you. And maybe just in threes, just how does this land for you? Immediately, just your sense of it, how does it land? We'll come back to it again and again, but maybe we can, if you don't mind, just have some conversation. Over to you for not more than 2 or 3 minutes. Just how does it land? That's how does it land? I hope that, that just to leave what's been shared in the threes, to treat that as confidential. I think we always want to honour that, but I wonder if there's just anything emerging for you. Just, we've got a few minutes just to interact very briefly. Just anything that's coming to the top of the surface, an observation, a disagreement, seen something differently, a light, a question. Yeah. I'd love just to get some sense of how this is landing for you this evening. And that would mean a lot. Any thoughts?
We were asked the question
Uh-huh.
about raising about family.
Uh-huh.
The ministry had seen this in both situations.
Right.
Still trying to process this,
Uh-huh.
but realizing that my family, the way I grew up, was grace-based,
Oh.
and then the vocational ministry situation I ended up was not that way.
Okay.
And so that internal
Sure.
conflict that I could.
Wow. Okay. Noticing a conflict between.
And so with that question,
My
the message
own-
went,
Sure. No. Sure. Noticing a difference between my own formation by grace, and then my own perhaps way of working. And I guess this model also is placed within a culture. It's not. It doesn't just stand as an abstract model, but we're in a culture that is also got a certain way of operating, which deeply, deeply affects our formation as pastors as well. And I think this model begins to put us in touch with that. So thank you for that noticing. Really appreciate that. Just any other wonderings, thoughts that are just kind of coming to the, just in your mind?
I'm just intrigued by how the entire American machine runs the opposite direction, and so it feels true, but it feels so counterintuitive.
Sure.
And not easy to quantify.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah. And I think all I can do is just to honor what you've said at the moment. I'm not part of your culture. I observe it at times, but that the culture is one that is very strongly, you're saying, one that moves this way. And I think, again, just noticing that, and maybe even noticing the effects of that culture, this culture, your culture, upon your own, and me noticing how culture in my country affects the way I do ministry, I think is really critical, that we don't do ministry, in a kind of spiritual vacuum, that deeply formed by culture and our national life. Thank you, really appreciate it. Maybe one or two more and then I don't want to push it, but I just need to have some sense of how it's landing.
That dynamic between a culture that's in reverse or a free market capitalism that says your worth is the number of pieces or number of souls.
Sure.
Number of grades you got, the
Sure.
over a B+.
Sure.
The dynamic of family or economy or
Right.
nation. The premise that the church and the home are two redemptive pieces of God's creation
Sure.
that were by design intended
Sure.
to flow in the opposite direction.
Sure.
The Dennis Guernsey Fuller on the Family Covenant established that premise for
Sure.
the marriage and family. The
thank
Family
you.
Covenant is a covenant of grace.
Thank you. Did you hear that? I just find that so helpful, that, that within a culture that works very strongly this way around, perhaps the calling of maybe home or church, maybe to be, you used a lovely phrase, redemptive spaces,
I think I did mention it could be countercultural or it could be redemptive
Right. Right.
analogy.
Thank you. And there's a lovely phrase from Brother Roger when he was alive from Taizé. He would often speak about us being called to be signs of contradiction. I love that phrase. Just signs of contradiction. And the church to be a community of contradiction. And again, to work out that in terms of some of the details, which you've mentioned, is quite challenging. Maybe one more thought, and thank you for being willing to interact with.
We talked also a little bit about culture and being in ministry in a kind of particular culture and moment in our culture where the church is maybe sliding towards irrelevance rather than even greater relevance, and there being kind of a block from between sustenance and significance. That when we're being fed and we're being nurtured in acceptance and in sustenance, but then if our congregations are shrinking or are becoming increasingly discouraged or
ignore us.
Or ignore us. How do we understand that significance and feel that significance, even if we may not be moving towards fruitfulness?
And you're speaking about how we as pastors feel that significance when there might be a kind of atmosphere of discouragement or being ignored or right. And how do I discover significance when my context of ministry has really perhaps sidelined me, or I think you're putting your finger on something very, very...
His finger.
Well, no. Thank you. And I wonder, but can I come back to... I won't go down too far down this road tonight, but I wonder if there's something about not putting this before that, so that this comes out of this particular movement. My personal feeling is that very often within the faith communities we've underplayed the identity one. We find our identity almost in penultimate identities rather than our fundamental identity as beloved. And I wonder if a sense of significance can maybe begin to flow when I realize that God is calling me by name, and I wonder what my name is. Well, friends, I know. Sorry.
I just want, I feel like kind of line with some of what you're saying, that acceptance and significance get conflated.
It feels conflated.
That we conflate them
okay.
in our culture, even in how we talk about this in church, about who are we, and I just ask myself, how can we this week practice not conflating the two? Like leading with acceptance, not with significance. And that whole game that we play, where if I can convince you that I'm significant, maybe you'll accept, or whatever. That's what the thought.
Thank you. I think there is a real danger of use the word conflating acceptance and significance. In the model, they are significantly different.
Yes.
And I'm appreciative just of keeping the distinction, which I think could also be helpful just for our own ongoing explorations around this.